It's my privilege to introduce Genger Charles to you. I actually shouldn't like Genger very much because she is one of the most accomplished people I know, and she's decades younger than I am, and I sort of don't like that, but there it is. Genger was Deputy Commissioner for Housing in the Obama administration. That means basically she was the equivalent of the Chief Operating Officer of the FHA program. Say that's an accurate depiction of your job. And I had the privilege of working with Genger for a year when I was in the Obama administration. And when I think about Genger, I think about the old E.F. Hutton commercial. Anybody remember E.F. Hutton stockbroker commercials from like 20, 30 years ago? Nobody?
I don't, because I'm decades
Well, yeah,
younger
because
than
you're too young. So there'd be these two guys at a table, and they were talking about a stock. And one guy would say to the other, "My broker is E.F. Hutton," and E.F. Hutton says, and like everybody else in the restaurant suddenly cocks their ears. And the tagline was, "When E.F. Hutton talks, people listen." How many of you remember that? Anybody? Oh, God, we're old. Okay, it was a good ad. Anyway, I got to go to a lot of meetings with Genger, and one of the things about her was that when she talked, it's like everybody strained to hear what she had to say, because they really wanted to know what she had to say. It was worth concentrating on her words. And so that makes her an excellent keynoter for an event like this. She's an expert on housing finance, and everything that comes out of her mouth is worth listening to. And so, Genger Charles, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard, for the introduction. And thank you to the Lusk Center for having me here today. And thank you to the team who put this event together. Can I get a round of applause for Marilyn and the rest of the team? And I recognize it's me and your break, so I will try and be brief. And thank you all for being here and for coming to the event and for joining me on what I have decided I would like to call my Free to Speak tour. I just left government about a month ago, and so finally, after a decade of service, which with Richard's introduction, I realize might be shocking, but you know, it's life. I can say that these views are actually my own and mean it, and also be as candid and frank as I want to be. And as Richard sort of alluded to, I have a lot of opinions. I have a lot of things that I have always wanted to say, many of which have been veiled by talking points and speechwriters. Don't get me wrong, unlike some who are in the public consciousness these days, I don't believe in being totally unscripted, so I do have a written speech. But that being said, you know, talking points have a value, especially when, you know, I don't know if you've ever noticed, if you go to an event with a politician, how they barely touch on whatever it is the topic of the event is, because they have talking points. And the beauty of talking points is that you actually get to say whatever you want, regardless of what the event is about. Fortunately for you, I recognize that I am obliged to talk about multifamily housing today, and I plan to do that. I will say, and listening to the panel before me, my remarks may be a little on the nose, and also maybe a little bit differing from some of our panelists. So hopefully that stokes some sort of a conflict that you all can discuss after the break, during the break and after the break and with the next panel. Specifically, I want to talk about the housing ecosystem more broadly and maybe offer some behind the scenes perspective on how policymakers think about it or thought about it. We'll see, you know, how that plays out and what the future holds. I would say, going back to this last panel, that Chris mentioned that housing markets don't build for low-income families. And I would say that certainly they don't build enough for low-income families, but I think they should. I think you should. And certainly every day for the 10 years that I walked the halls of a federal building, I thought about the families, and we all thought about the families who lived in the housing that your work helps create. And I think that's what this industry is supposed to be about. And consequently, in my time in government, I spent a lot of time channeling my college economics classes, trying to, when I was weighing in on pricing decisions for FHA mortgage insurance premiums, and trying to figure out how does it play out when the relationship between the government and a lender, and and that where there's a cost involved gets passed on to the borrower, and how does that impact supply and demand for a product, and ultimately how does that impact what I think is the view of FHA, and how does it facilitate it, which is to create and preserve safe, decent, affordable housing units in partnership with non-governmental players and partners. And so whether that borrower is an individual, a nonprofit assisted housing provider, a market rate developer, or a regional hospital system, because yes, FHA is and HUD are actually in the business of facilitating financing of healthcare facilities at all. Little known fact. So if you didn't learn anything else new today, I hope those of you who didn't know that, learn that today. It is never lost on us in the building in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere, including here in downtown LA, that those costs get passed on. And yet you had to balance that fact and with the fact that these things do come at a cost, and there's a cost to the government absorbing the risk of default, and that the insurance must be paid for. But you have to balance that with trying to set the pricing at such a way that you get to the most economically and socially efficient outcome. And that, that in and of itself, some of you will recognize that as the Coase Theorem, which is a timely anecdote with the Nobel Prize in economics being awarded this week. Ronald Coase actually won a Nobel for that theorem in 1991. And certainly it guided the work that I did and how I viewed my role, and I think how my peers viewed their roles as well, because when it comes to the housing market and the role of government in facilitating that outcome, especially in recent years, the government and our colleagues in the private sector were really put to the test. The greatest economic crisis since the Great Depression, the Great Recession, wreaked havoc on communities across the country, most especially here in Southern California. According to Zillow, at its peak, nearly a third of US homeowners were underwater, and locally, about half, 53.4% of homeowners in Riverside, as an example, were underwater, according to that same Zillow report. Because during the housing boom, as you all know, folks flocked to states like Arizona and California and the Sand States, attracted by jobs, the weather, which compared to the East Coast is lovely, and relatively low cost of living. But also credit was cheap. So people bought homes when they may have otherwise been renters in those markets, because after all, that was the American dream. But when millions of people began losing their jobs in late 2007 and 2008, the demand for those newly constructed homes evaporated, pushing down local home values, and admittedly, due to less than savory products on the street at the time, such as those that didn't require any paper, the opposite of the FHA program, by the way, negative equity soared. So no job, no equity in your home, an already questionable ability to pay, put families in distress, and it decimated communities. And that was, around that time is when I joined HUD. And I was in the general counsel's office at that point, and my first assignment was to help design one of the initiatives that was designed to stem the bleeding in the housing market. And that brings to mind one of my favorite talking points. So on occasion, they are useful, and they remain with you even when you're out, which is, according to Mark Zandi at Moody Analytics, who I'm sure you're familiar with, without the FHA single-family program, home prices would have declined an additional 25% nationwide. Let's take a minute and reflect on what you think would have happened if, during the worst crisis since the Great Depression, a place like the Inland Empire had a further decline of 25% of home prices. And it was not, this, as you know, this whole thing was not just isolated to the single-family market. In multifamily, with securities being decimated and the recession taking hold, all of a sudden, what may have seemed like a simple subprime lending issue was suddenly a global crisis. Investors got scared, or they no longer existed. Traditional sources of multifamily financing, tax credits, bond issuances, and other forms of money or credit enhancement disappeared. And with it, the cranes in the sky. And enter again FHA. where multifamily volume increased exponentially, with much of it not going to affordable housing construction. And let's recall that my view, and I think traditionally the agency's view of what FHA is designed to do, is to provide safe, decent, affordable housing, typically thought of as with some form of subsidy, and to help preserve and create those units. But during the crisis, FHA found itself really salvaging market rate deals that had been stalled and without the assistance of the government could not have gotten done. Now, here's the thing. You've heard this story again and again. And like the Great Depression, you will hear about the Great Recession until another comparable event happens. It will be a marker of the nation's economic history in perpetuity. But what we don't actually spend a lot of time talking about when we discuss the Great Recession is the underlying microeconomics that were aggravated by the crisis. Because, at least in my view, it only exacerbated a trend which was already kind of coming down the tracks, which is declining affordability. And I'm defining affordability for this purpose as affordable to in this case, a renter or a homeowner, someone who, is paying less than 20 or 30% of their income for housing, whether it is subsidized or not. I remember first learning about externalities in high school economics, and you all know much better than I do that an externality is the impact a transaction has on a party not directly involved in the transaction. So often a cost that is suffered by a third party as a result of the transaction. In the case of the Great Recession, all levels of government intervening and taking extraordinary steps to lift up the economy led to what I would argue is a pretty serious negative externality that we continue to live with today. That we haven't made much headway in fixing this issue of affordability, and as a result, fixing the consequences of that, which is access. 1.72 million families in California pay more than half of their income in rent, according to Make Room, which is itself interpreting the 2015 American Community Survey. That makes California 5th nationwide in the percentage of renters who pay more than half their income on rent. Around 30% of the total renter population nationwide pays more than half their income on rent, and the vast majority of those people have children. Nearly 250,000 of those people work, but they don't hold jobs that you would perceive as blue collar. They actually work in office buildings like the one surrounding this hotel in places like downtown Los Angeles. So what this says to me is that the type of job that we used to consider a middle-class job in this country now puts many families on the brink, having to consider what is it that they are going to pay this month. Are they going to pay rent, tuition, electricity, or any other number of fixed costs for not only themselves as individuals, but their families, including, again, their children. But rest assured, that's not just a California issue. According to the Urban Institute, since 2000, rents have continued to rise while the number of renters needing affordable housing has also increased. Nationally, and I think these statistics are pretty startling, nationally there are about 5.3 million affordable units available for the 11.7 million extremely low income renters nationwide. So extremely low is a subset of the people who actually need the access to affordable housing. And those numbers are as of April 2017, calculated by the Urban Institute. And this is, I know this from personal experience, only about 2.6 million of those 5.3 million units available, total, have HUD or USDA rental assistance, which means that the need for naturally affordable units is massive. And just to underscore this, that 2.6 million, that isn't project-based Section 8 or vouchers. That is those plus public housing. So that is a total of 2.6 million units of federal government-assisted housing for a population of 11.7. That is 11 million people who pay more than half their income in rent, over 20 million spend more than 20% of their income on rent, and there are less than 3 million units with federal assistance. So, again, hearkening back to the panel earlier, that's a supply problem in the face of high demand. And that demand is aggravated by economic and policy decisions. Because admittedly, it's hard to figure out the right lever. It's hard to figure out what is the thing that will help solve the problem. And so I personally applaud Governor Brown and my former colleague Ben Metcalf, who, with many other leaders here in the state of California last month, moved forward the package that the panel was talking about earlier. Not because I don't think, like clearly many in this room think that it could be tweaked, certainly, and it's not a thing that we may agree with in total, but particularly in the Washington that I left behind, if states don't confront these issues head on, I'm not sure anyone else will. So I was heartened to see that the GOP tax reform proposal keeps at least some of the implied support for the low-income housing tax credit. And I think the impact of the increase in the standard deduction on individuals remains to be seen, but could potentially help address some of these factors, but it may not, and I leave it to the bright minds at USC and elsewhere to figure that out. But the fact is, it almost doesn't matter, because wherever tax reform lands, it's going to take some time to figure it out. Because all the legislative dysfunction and distraction that you've heard of that is happening in Washington is 100% true. And add to that list of beyond tax reform, housing finance reform, and this magical infrastructure bill, and just the business of running a government, that all these talk and these stunts and these mounting legislative needs are coming to a head, and we have issues that we need to address now. And so for that reason, I do applaud the state of California for at least getting ahead and trying to take some steps forward. And that particular bill, or I guess it was a package of 15 bills that were signed by Governor Brown, actually happened at a property that has some familiar with called Hunter's View in San Francisco. Hunter's View is formerly public housing that's now undergoing a capitalization and revitalization effort through what is called the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, or affectionately known as RAD. I'm sure at least some of you in the room have some familiarity with the RAD program. And it's one that I personally had jurisdiction with, including a lot of hand-wringing over the Hunter's View transaction and many others that were part of Mayor Lee's HOPE SF effort. But through the RAD program, public housing, which is deteriorating due to a lack of federal investment in government-owned property. Let's keep in mind, public housing is owned by the government. So we are housing people, but we are not investing in keeping those properties viable for the people who live in them, and we are just sitting on deteriorating rental assets. And through RAD, we can revitalize and reposition the financing of those properties and allow them to engage in standard to substantial rehabilitation. And so, I believe RAD has been a topic of discussion in Los Angeles with HACLA and other agencies. And while in the case of RAD, Public Housing Authority retains ownership or at a minimum substantial control over the property, outside developers and other private partners participate in the effort. And that allows those federal dollars to go further. But as soon as tax reform came on the table, the value of those tax credits just declined substantially, on a theory of a thing that has to happen when a bunch of people actually get in a room and attempt to start doing their jobs. And so ultimately, some of those transactions have been stalled indefinitely, meaning that we as taxpayers continue to sit on deteriorating assets. And those are not the only dollars that are dwindling in this environment, impacting what I think is an obligation to work on this affordability crisis, but rather the HUD budget released earlier this year proposes a $6 billion cut to the agency. And that's not just people. There aren't people making $6 billion of salaries who are suddenly just going to lose their jobs because the government is bloated, but that's cuts to project-based rental assistance. For those of you who have been paying attention, those are substantial cuts to PBRA and PRAC programs and others that are a resource not only to RAD, but that can help other rental transactions actually pencil. That cuts the CDBG and the Community Development Block Grant and other programs that communities use to that can be used to revitalize communities and encourage investment in thriving mixed income places. I would posit, I don't know this for sure, someone else can weigh in, that part of the reason why like downtown Los Angeles, DTLA, is able to kind of take off is in part leveraging federal investment of dollars that are potentially going to disappear. I know that's true of my own neighborhood in Washington. The thing is, these externalities cut both ways. FHA scaling up during the Great Recession put a floor on home prices, allowed some multifamily developments to proceed at a time when shovels were being thrown in the backs of trucks instead of being digging into the ground. And yet, that availability came at a time of slow to negative growth in incomes. And so as a minimum, as I've posited, has prolonged affordability. But getting rid of or even greatly diminishing the impact of HUD, FHA, and other federal programs that invest in housing community development is not the answer. In fact, it is, in my opinion, far from the answer because, as I mentioned earlier, most of these extremely low-income families have children, and they are, contrary to the messaging that is out there, they are working in the buildings that surround this hotel. And that impacts local tax bases, schools, infrastructure, and a host of other issues, which, I would, as I wrap this up, I would merely say, I would suspect that there is a connection between these issues of access to safe, decent, affordable housing, whatever affordable means to you, and, for instance, the tuition that some of you pay to send your kids to private school because you don't want to send your kids to public school because the public schools are underfunded, because there is no tax base. And I'm sure that's only aggravated by Prop 13, which I'm told is like the third real issue in the state of California. It's impacted by decreased home ownership, higher vacancy rates, and other aspects of the tax code and other aspects of policy, including the history of FHA, which I think Richard alluded to earlier. So, as I wrap this up, I would say the last thing that I get to do here, which is the thing I have not been able to do in my professional career, is make a call to action. Pay attention to what is going on. Washington, Sacramento, wherever, is most especially now more of a mess than you ever thought it was before. So call your congressman, call your senator, call the governor's office, call my friend Ben, make it local. Like, pay attention. If you don't like what is in triple, quadruple, like 12J, whatever, like, make it known. Like, because the people who are working on these things are doing the best thing that they think and weighing the considerations that they have before them, but you have information and intelligence that they should at least be able to weigh in making these decisions. And fact is, many of the best things in American history have derived from political activism. So pay attention. But also remember that not only is it good and right to care for your fellow man and woman, it can pay dividends. It is not impossible to make money off of an affordable transaction. In fact, putting affordable units on the street can not only, or in the market, can not only help families, help communities, support schools, reduce crime, lead to better outcomes for the children, and lead to better outcomes for children, but it can also open up new lines of revenue and partnership, new opportunities for you in your business efforts and other efforts that are worth considering. It's also a place where you can benefit from a number of incentives or satisfy mandates. And so, if nothing else, perhaps it can help reduce the vitriol in our country today. And because at the end of the day, we are all in this together. Thank you.